come to order. Thank you for being here. Thanks. We have completed the bill work that we had before us, and we'll look forward to our floor work. We do have one item of business to address, and that would be the minutes for the meetings that we have, the 10th, 15th, and 17th. Are there any additions or corrections? And if not, is there a motion? Representative
Move to
Dodson.
approve.
Oh, who made the distributed? Seconded by Representative Dodson. Any questions or discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it, and the minutes are approved. Thank you to the committee secretary and the committee for that. With that, we will move into our informational briefing, and would welcome Jared to the committee with KPERS. Thank you for your work. Committee, this is a question that I had watching the previous years. When we looked at the original design of Tier 3, the goal was to provide some additional market performance that was there, and it had been a little light in the previous years. And Jared is here to review kind of how we got there and what might be happening currently. So thank you and welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and committee members. It's nice to be over here and speaking with the committee. I understand I have 90 minutes to run through this. Is that right? So you should have a slide deck that we provided, and I'll just be walking you through that this afternoon. On page 2 is just a little look at what we're going to cover today. There's some history, the KPERS 3 plan design, contributions, and then a little more on the retirement side for KPERS 3. So if you switch to page 3, talking a little bit about history, the KPERS 3 cash balance plan really, its roots are in the Great Recession of 2008. If you remember at that time, the investment losses were pretty severe in that time period, and the long-term funding outlook for the plan really turned pretty negative. And so the legislature took a hard look at the funding plan that was in place and considered changes that might be necessary. The 2011 legislature really did a lot of heavy lifting looking at specific legislation, ultimately created a study commission that spent the interim, I think they had 11 meetings over the 2011 interim to look at the topic and look at all the different plan design options. And then they made some recommendations to the 2012 legislature. The 2012 legislature reviewed the report, ultimately didn't take all of the recommendations of the study commission, but you can see on page 4 the 3 key pieces of that pension reform in 2012. Higher employer contributions. This was accomplished by raising the cap on the annual increase for employer contributions. Higher employee contributions was the second piece, and that was moving the KPERS 1 group, which was the largest active group at the time. It's actually still the largest active group today, although KPERS 3 will overtake that in the next year or two, I'm pretty sure. Moving them from a 4% employee contribution to 6% over a 2-year time period. And then what I'm here to talk about today, the creation of this cash balance plan. So moving to page 5, looking at the plan design of the cash balance plan, you can see there across the top, we're calling it a defined benefit plan with defined contribution characteristics. And so what I mean by that is if you think about a pure defined benefit plan, that's got your traditional formula, most likely of some multiplier times your years of service times the final average salary. That calculates your benefit. You receive that benefit for the rest of your life after retirement. On the other side, you've got the defined contribution plan, which is like a traditional 401k. The member is making some contribution. Employer is making some match or some set contribution to those member accounts, and then the member is responsible for investing that money and earning interest on that account. And then at retirement, whatever the account balance is, will turn in the individual member will turn into their retirement. So you can see I've laid out some of the defined contribution and defined benefit features of the cash balance plan. So like a defined contribution plan, these KPERS 3 members, they all have their own individual accounts for member contributions and employer credits. But it's not like a bank account where you're putting $1 in and everybody has their own individual bank account. We're still pooling all of those assets together into a single trust fund, and the funds in that trust fund are managed centrally, but we're accounting for each individual member and all of the contributions that are made that they make and the credits on the employer side, interest earned on those accounts, and then that account balance for those KPERS 3 members is what we use to calculate their benefit at retirement. A key feature key defined benefit feature is on the employer contribution side, and that is that it's not a match of contributions or anything like that. It's calculated on an actuarial basis. So each year the actuary is looking at what the total liabilities are, how many assets are on hand. They look at how many assets should be on hand, and if there's a shortfall, which, as you know, for CAPERS, we're about 70% funded, so there is a shortfall that still needs to be funded. And the actuary calculates, based on payroll, what the contribution rate needs to be to fund the current year's benefits and anything that is from past, for past benefits, to fund that by the end of the amortization period. So each year the actuary sets what that rate is going to be, and the employer is paying that rate. You know, contrasting that to a defined contribution plan where it's typically set for the employer. They know what the rate is going to be each year. The only thing that would change is perhaps covered payroll. But for the cash balance plan, it's still that actuarial calculation. And then the key piece, the key defined benefit feature of the cash balance plan that really makes it, by definition, still a defined benefit plan, is that those benefits are guaranteed for life. There's no way that a member can have their benefits stopped before they pass away. And that, by definition, is a defined benefit plan. So while there are characteristics of both types, a cash balance plan is still a defined benefit plan. On page 6, just a graphic snapshot that we share with our members. A cash balance plan is not a real common retirement plan. So we put this together just to help people sort of grasp the overall concept. You can see there in blue, you're making your contributions, you're earning credits from your employer, you're earning interest on those accounts, you're reaching your vesting period at 5 years, and then in retirement, we use those accounts to calculate your benefits, and you receive that benefit for a lifetime. We move into the contribution side of things. As I said, the contribution structure of the cash balance plan tends to be more like a defined benefit plan than a defined contribution plan. For the employee side, it's 6%, and that's set in statute. The employer cannot choose to put in less or put in more. They're required to put in that 6%, and it's mandatory. They have to participate. All of those contributions are tracked by each individual member in their own notional account that we keep track of, and that account earns interest. It's guaranteed at 4% per year, and we credit that on a quarterly basis. So it's 4% annual, but it's compounded quarterly. There's also additional dividend credits that can be applied to the accounts. There's a couple bullets there that talk about what the formula is for that dividend and an example, but I have more slides later that have a little bit more detail, so I'm just going to skip over that for now and talk about it later. On the employer contribution side, as I stressed a couple slides ago, it's still that actuarial calculation. So you can see in those bullets what the calculated rates are for fiscal year 22 for the state school group, and calendar year 22 for the local group. It's just over 14% for state school employers and 8.9% for local employers. And I think one thing that people often confuse on this contribution rate, that 14% is not a contribution rate that's going to each member. Remember, we're still centrally managing the trust fund, and that 14% is what's necessary to pay for each member's benefit plus the past service that hasn't been funded. So that covers both of those pieces, that 14%. The employer contributions are the same, whether you're a CAPERS 1, CAPERS 2, or CAPERS 3 member, there's no difference. So it's just total covered payroll times what that CAPERS rate is for all your CAPERS members. And as I said, that 14% is not related to the employer credits that are going to each individual member. And those employer credits are on the next page. And there's a table there that lays out what those credits are. And then, as you can see, it's based on your years of service. They go up over time. The longer tenured you are, the more the credits, your employer credits will be. These employer credits are earned each quarter. And they, as you can see, they depend on your years of service, and then you also earn interest quarterly on your employer account. Now, these employer accounts are different than the member accounts. The member account is always 100% vested to the member. They always have access to withdraw those funds if they don't want to receive a benefit. Employer contributions, these employer credits, they cannot be withdrawn. You never reach a vesting period where you can withdraw employer contributions. The only way they can be utilized is in a retirement benefit. Moving to slide 10, we'll talk about the interest credits. As I mentioned, there's a guaranteed interest rate for these accounts. So regardless of what happens on the investments of the trust fund in any year, each member account is guaranteed 4% annual interest on both their member and employer credit accounts. It's applied each quarter, so as you can see, since it's compounded interest in that last bullet, we're actually applying 0.985341% per quarter for each member. So it's not a full 1% each quarter. On page 11, then now we're into these dividend credits. So the dividend credit, when it was created, a dividend credit was made discretionary to the Board of Trustees. There were concerns about that level of delegation to the board. It was a different function than had ever been delegated before. So ultimately, the legislature changed that from a discretionary dividend to a formulaic dividend. The dividend formula is based on actual investment performance of the trust fund, and then we review that investment performance each March, and if a dividend can be paid, it's applied to the previous December's account balance. So, and you can see in that bullet at the bottom, it's just an example. The board actually just a week ago reviewed what the 5-year average was. A dividend is going to be paid for calendar year 2020. It won't be paid until March 31st, but it's going to apply to what was in their accounts on December 31st. So it's not applied as of the date that it's paid, it's applied as of December 31st. Page 12 reviews what the formula actually is. It's set in KSA 74-49306, and it's equal to 75% of the average net compound rate of return above 6%, as determined by the board for each calendar year and the 4 preceding calendar years. That's the statutory language. So there in my hypothetical example, if we had a compound rate of return over 5 years of 8%, that beats that 6% target by 2%. So then you take 75% of that 2% to figure out what the dividend is. In this hypothetical example, it's 1.5%. Calendar year 2020 was our 6th year of the KPERS 3 plan, and the 2nd year that we had that 5-year rolling average in place. Prior to having 5 years of average, there was statutory provisions for the 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year, and 4th year that just established a 1-year average, 2-year average, et cetera, and then it had an ultimate cap of 1.5% on those first 4 years. But now we're beyond that 5-year period, so we're into the rolling 5-year average. Page 13 shows the experience of those dividends over the first 6 years. As I mentioned, they're reviewed every March by the Board of Trustees and applied in the previous December. In the first 6 years, we've had 3 years where there was no dividend applied, and now 3 years where there has been a dividend applied. And they're laid out there in the table. You can see 2017, 19, and 20 are the 3 years, and the amount of those dividends that were paid in those years. If somebody had been a member on January 1 of 2015, and they were still a member on December 31st of 2020, the total interest crediting rate over that 6-year period, our actuary calculated, was 4.73%. That's the 4% guarantee plus the dividend added together. So it comes out to 4.73 for those 6 years. Of course, it's dependent on when you started. If somebody started on January 1st of 2017, it would be slightly higher because they would have 3 out of the 4 years that they'd worked, they would have received a dividend. So it's going to depend greatly on when people started and when people leave. But over the 6-year period, the total interest crediting rate has been about 4.73%. As you move into the retirement on page 14, KPERS 3 has the same vesting requirements as KPERS 1 and KPERS 2. It's that 5-year time period. And their full and reduced retirement ages is the same as what that was set for KPERS 2 when that was created. And those are age 60 with 30 years of service or age 65 with 5 years of service. That's when you can receive full unreduced benefits. If you don't want to wait that long, you can go earlier than that, as early as age 55 if you have 10 years of service. But there's an actuarial reduction to your benefit, and that the reduction will depend based on how long before full retirement you actually decide to leave. So you can go earlier, but you end up with a reduced benefit if you make that choice. On page 15 lays out some of the benefit options. Of course, there's many selections you can make at retirement. You You can obviously take the maximum benefit, which they would take your account balances and calculate what the benefit would be just for you. And you could receive that every month for the rest of your life. If you're not as certain about how long your life might be, or if you have somebody else that you're hoping to make sure is taken care of after you pass on, you might make one of these other benefit selections. So by statute, when the KPERS 3 plan was created, the 10-year life certain option was selected as the base benefit. Essentially, that means that no matter what happens after retirement, your benefit will be paid for 10 years. If you die the day after you retire, that benefit will still be paid to a beneficiary for 10 years. It's guaranteed. There's also a 5-year or a 15-year option. In addition, there's some joint survivor options, which if you have, say, a surviving spouse, that would be the most common scenario. You could choose, you could say, okay, I want to provide 50% of my retirement benefit to continue after I die to go to my spouse, or you can do 75% or 100%. Any of those options will have some actuarial reduction below the maximum, and it's going to depend on who your surviving beneficiaries are, but those calculations are made on an actuarial basis. The KPERS 3 plan is unique in that it has a COLA option. Of course, that's self-funded. They can choose to have a COLA of 1%, I should say, a cost of living adjustment, which means their benefit would increase each year over time by either 1% or 2%. In order to take that option, your benefit is reduced on the front end when you first are retired, but then over time that would grow. And then, of course, they can take partial lump sum options. They can choose to withdraw, I'm sorry, it's not a withdrawal, it's a benefit payment of any increment of a full 1% up to 30%. So they could choose 22% if they wanted to, but they can't go above that 30% threshold, and they can't choose any decimal. It has to be a full percent. These last couple of slides that I have are looking at a comparison, really, of KPERS 2 and KPERS 3. I'm doing this through the use of replacement ratios. And the reason we do this is because the KPERS 3 plan design is pretty dramatically different than the traditional defined benefit plan of KPERS 2. And it's really hard, especially for an individual, to see what the difference might be between the two. So it's good to have a standard measurement of comparison, and that's what this replacement ratio is. Replacement ratios are often used sort of in financial planning when we're talking about retirement. You want to aim for a certain percent of your final year's salary to replace so that you can maintain the same standard of living in retirement. The general rule of thumb is about 80% to 90%. That's on the sort of the financial services side of things. That's not a KPERS number. And I'm not a financial services expert, but my understanding is 80% to 90% is sort of the general rule of thumb of what you're trying to replace in retirement. That's not the KPERS retirement, that's your total retirement picture. So KPERS has never been designed to be a single retirement vehicle. It's supposed to be the total picture. So KPERS is not trying to replace 80%. Each individual is trying to replace that 80% to 90%, okay? Now, in general, you'll see on the next page, there's some bar graphs. In general, a traditional defined benefit plan, like KPERS 2, it's expected to provide a higher benefit for a career employee than a KPERS 3 plan. But that's not necessarily true across the board. For early career or mid-career, that might look a little different. And if you look on page 17, so what we did here with our actuary, we took one generic employee and we set a number of assumptions for this person. If they work from age 25 to age 65, so they have a 40-year career, we set up a generic salary growth scale for that person. And then we compared what the benefits might look like under KPERS 2, which is the orange bars, and KPERS 3, which is both the blue and green bars. The blue is just the 4% guaranteed interest rate, and then the green is 6.25%, which takes into account some dividends for that member. And what these percentages on the bars are comparing to is they're looking at that last salary at age 65 for this person and what the benefit would replace of that final salary. So if their final salary is $50,000, if you look at that first orange bar, we would expect it replaces 51%, so that'd be $25,000 and 500 is what we would expect that benefit to replace, okay? Now this is a very specific scenario. It's going to vary widely by each individual, but this gives you sort of a ballpark view of what you might expect from a traditional defined benefit plan compared to the cash balance plan. So on the far left, that's the career employee. That's somebody who works for 30 years. They start at 35, they go all the way to 65, and they retire from KPERS. As you can see, the KPERS 2 benefit in that orange bar, it's estimated at 51%. And under the KPERS 3 plan, with just the guarantee, it's 27. With some dividends, it's up to 38%. And if you just think about the pure design of the plans, it makes sense to look like this. The traditional defined benefit plan is heavily weighted towards final salaries. There's typically an average salary calculation that just takes into account some small number of years at the end of your career. For KPERS 2, that's 5 years. So it's more a measurement of what your final salary is. KPERS 3 plan is using your account balances to calculate your benefit. So it's using the first contribution you made in your first paycheck is included in that account balance, and the last contribution you made in your last paycheck. So it's more of a career average. So it's not unexpected necessarily to see that difference for a career employee. If you look towards the two middle sections, the early career and the mid-career, some people have been surprised to see that 5% on the early career when you're talking about the KPERS 2 benefit, because you still have that 10 years of service. So, you know, with the multiplier of 1.85%, you should be replacing close to 20%, 18.5% is what you would expect sort of intuitively. But we're comparing that benefit to their final age 65 salary. They left KPERS at age 35 in that scenario. So they left behind an early career average salary, and because that defined benefit plan is so dependent on what that final average salary is, when you compare that benefit to what they were making at age 65, you're only looking to replace about 5% of that. Compare that to the cash balance plan, where it's still that early career salary and the contributions on that early career salary, but what that person has an advantage of the cash balance plan is the compound interest. They have 30 years of interest on those accounts growing over time that keeps that account balance going up and up over time. And so for that member, it replaces a larger proportion of their final year's salary under the cash balance plan. It's similar in mid-career, although it's much closer. You know, for the traditional defined benefit plan, you've got that mid-career salary, which is a little closer to what you're having at the end of your career, and you have less time for compound interest on the cash balance plan, so it's a little more even between the two plans for the mid-career. And then the late career scenario, this one really shows the importance of those final year's salaries, because that person only works for 20 years, but it's the last years of their career, so their highest salaries are what's going into their KPERS 2 benefit calculation, and that bumps up what their expected replacement ratio would be. Now this, I want to be clear, there's no judgment included in this chart in terms of benefit quality. This is a comparison tool, and it really allows policymakers to review the plan and make sure that it's meeting the goals of the retirement system for the public workforce. This isn't trying to say one is better than the other, it's purely just what you can expect, and is that meeting the goals that the legislature set in place. And then the final slide we have is just to point out, this is a message that KPERS has keyed in on for some time. And it really goes back before the KPERS 3 plan. You know, probably 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, there was a reasonable expectation that Social Security and KPERS could get you through retirement. But there's been a lot of changes to Social Security. There's been a lot of changes to KPERS. There could be more changes coming to Social Security. So we really stress with members that if, you need to look at what your replacement needs are going to be, which is a hard message for, our 30-year-olds and even probably 40-year-olds. But they need to know sort of what their target is and have a reasonable expectation of what KPERS and Social Security can provide, and then understand that they have to make up whatever that difference is. And it's going to differ for each person. Some may not need as much as others. But it's an individual thing that they're going to have to keep in mind as they progress towards retirement. And that's all I have in terms of information. There's just a wrap-up slide, and I'd be happy to try and respond to any questions that the committee has.
Thank you. Committee questions? Representative Dodson.
Just a quick question, please. On the bar chart slide that you showed, is that how someone might do some career planning? In other words, look at those scenarios and kind of choose which one might maximize?
Yes, I mean, that would be one use for this kind of information. One thing I will say is it's very difficult for an individual to do this kind of analysis. And just because everybody has, there's a million different nuances amongst our active members in terms of what their career progression looks like and what their salary progression looks like. So the answer is yes, that's what a replacement ratio, what these charts would be used for, but it is very difficult for individual members to do it.
Thank you. Looking at that and the impact of the cash balance plan for a late career employee, the military pension may be more valuable. I have a few questions, but does anyone else have questions? Representative Proctor.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Catch it because I was holding on as tight as I could to try to keep up with you. But all the assets that the employers and the employees pay into KPERS 3, is that all in the same asset pool with KPERS 1 and KPERS 2? And then as a kind of adjunct question to that, when we were in here talking about unfunded liabilities in KPERS, is Tier 3 part of that, or is that in a separate pool of money?
So KPERS just has the single trust fund. So KPERS 1, 2, and 3, all employer and employee contributions go into the single trust fund, and it's managed centrally by we have an internal investment team, and it's primarily handled by external managers, and then we have oversight within KPERS. But it's all in the single trust fund. And it's true of KP&F and judges too, even though they're separate plans, we just have the single trust fund for all plans.
So as a follow-up to that, would you say that like how much we're paying in, employee and employers are paying into KPERS 3, are we contributing to a growing unfunded liability, or are we catching it up at all? What's your sense?
So right now, that depends on many factors. So a big factor is that we're reaching the end of an amortization period that was set in 1993. So just by a function of the way that funding plan was designed, we're on a downward slope of our unfunded liabilities. In addition to that, the state is making the full actuarial required contribution, and that is helping to make sure that we're keeping that trajectory in a downward slope on the unfunded liabilities. Now, the wild card in that, of course, is investment returns. So as long as investment returns hold out, we'll continue to go on that downward path on our unfunded liabilities. But we're not growing the liabilities based on any sort of plan design or contribution design at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Proctor. That's actually a question that I bother them with regularly, and they do have some detail on exactly what it takes to make sure that we are at least contributing the cost of the year of service that we owe the employees, plus the interest cost on that unfunded liability and any layered delayed contributions that are there to say, are we in effect growing or shrinking that debt? And for the last 3 years, we've been able in total contributions to be in a world where we might have been shrinking that.
Yes.
Although prior to that, we may have been growing it.
Correct.
So, and I know that, that either of our KPERS staff would be glad to share that slide with you if you want more detail on that. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we're going paperless PowerPoint.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. We'll be sure to follow up with that for you. Other questions? Representative Miller.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If Mr. Conroy was to give this presentation, could he do as well?
He might be able to do it in his sleep, I don't know.
Other questions, committee? I want to hit a couple of points that are there. I'll start on the cover sheet I just jotted down. Do you know what other states have a cash balance plan, and how dissimilar or similar we may be? Not that you should know, but.
I did look this up. I might have been tipped off to this question. Right now, there are 5 state plans, large state plans similar to Capers, that have a cash balance plan or some cash balance component. Nebraska was probably the first one in terms of statewide plans. They've had one for a number of years. Of course, Kansas has one. We were the second, I think, to pass one through legislation, but Kentucky followed up quickly and actually beat Kansas to implementation. So they passed the legislation after Kansas, but implemented before Kansas. Texas has a couple of different statewide plans for local employers that are cash balance. And then CalSTRS, the California Teachers Plan, they have, for a certain sector of their members, they have a cash balance plan. But the primary CalSTRS plan, of course, is the traditional defined benefit plan for most teachers. But I think for part-time, some part-time positions, they have a cash balance plan.
Thank you. At some point, it might be interesting to do a comparison of what their payouts are on those plans as we get more of a database to work with. So appreciate that. And thanks. This was exactly what I was hoping to get a sense for as we worked through it. Another question that came up as we went through the deck that was not an original question. On page 8, we have the contribution rates for the state and local group. And I've been pretty focused on the state school group, but as we look to that local group, I think we've been on the downslope of our UAL there. And would we project that 8.9 to continue to go lower for them? Just any color that you could add on their unfunded liability, the past and the projected contribution rates?
So the local group reached their actuarial rate about 6 years before the state did. And so there was maybe 3 or 4 years consecutive where that rate went down, and it has really leveled off sort of in this 8.5% to 9% range for the last 3 valuations or so. That's, the way it's designed. That should continue until the amortization period is over in 2033, which actually applies probably to calendar year 2035 for that group of employers. But I would expect it to sort of be in this range for another 10 years or so, and then it would drop off pretty dramatically just because the cost of the cash balance plan is quite a bit lower in terms of the ongoing normal cost for those benefits.
So thank you. So that one looks like it might stay more at a steady contribution rate rather than having the more of a mountain that we have with the state school unfunded liability. And just another thing that I'd maybe note is if there should ever be a reamortization on the state school group, would we also look at it for the local group? That's not something I'd expect you to have the answer to, but something we might want to look at. So thank you. On page 9, where Representative Proctor had a good question of, what we have a notional account, and the notional account is the value that the employee has, but that last line points out that the employer part of the notional account, and the employer account includes both the employer. Does it include the interest and the dividend on the formula, or what can a employee member withdraw if they wanted their contributions back?
So the member account would include both member contributions plus interest on those contributions. And the employer account would be the interest on the employer contributions, and they would not have access to that interest, only the interest on the member account.
Thank you. Thank you. And to Representative Smith's question, that's why I still print the things out so I can make all of my scratches and do some of my back of the envelope calculations along the way. On page 13, thanks for working through that. That was really the center of what I was looking for to get an idea. Is our dividend formula paying out what we might expect? we had some tough years that came along different times, and now we've had some pretty good returns. So we might get to see the good and the bad. For the committee, what I'm trying to get a sense for is, is what might those be going forward? And in particular, Jared, would you go through just what our annual calendar year returns have been? And I'm just going to jot them down on page 13 next to the years that we have. I only need the last 4 or so, but.
Yeah, and I will, but I need to make one quick clarification. So there's an amount that we typically report, and that's our gross return. That is our standard report that we make. The statute specifies that it's a net return, so these numbers are a net return. So they're not going to match perfectly what you would typically see us report, but the difference there is gross versus net.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
these numbers are the net return. In 2020, for the calendar year, the net return was 11.1%. Calendar year 2019 was 17.1%. Calendar year 2018 was negative 2.9%. Calendar year 17, 14%. And calendar year 16, 8.5%.
Thank you. So 16 gives us a quasi-average year that lets our expectations be consistent. 18 kind of blows the average for a little while, having that number in there, but 19 and 20 will be a couple pretty good years. That'll be in 3 more averages that come up as those years pass. And so far, 21 looks good. That certainly could change. But as we come up with whatever the formula is now and over time, we want to kind of get a sense of where that payout would fall to give the employee good participation in the fund, while recognizing the state is still on the hook for the 4% guarantee, which is also a pretty good guarantee to start with. It doesn't compare to 1 and 2 quite the way that we might like it to from a benefit standpoint, but in terms of what it provides, that balance is the key to try and get there. So if I have 19 at 17% and 20 at 11%, those are going to be over that 6% hurdle and add a lot to that formula for the 5 years that they happen to be in the average.
Right.
So thank you. We'll be looking for that, and employees then will be getting the 2.475% payout March 31st.
Yes, statute specifies the date. If there's administrative issues, we do have the language that as soon thereafter as practicable, but March 31st is the target date, yes.
Okay. And did they know that? Do they expect it? Do they know amounts? Will they get that information on the 31st?
For members?
Yes.
I'm not sure if that is included in the annual statements. No. I don't think we send out any specific notification to members. Of course, we don't actually do direct mailers to our members. We work through our employers based on some statutory language. So, no, the short answer is no, we aren't.
Okay. So it will be there, and it will show up credited on December 31st, but it will show on their account sometime thereafter. So anyway, something that could be a pleasant surprise for somebody to see finally a meaningful number be added there. So I'm excited to see that one, and it will be interesting to see how those good numbers affect it going forward. Previously, committee had had some concern because we hadn't had a lot pay out and was hoping to see a little more for the employees, but now we're seeing those enough time to see that average work out, and I'm much more encouraged by what it's doing. Page 15 on the benefit options. This may be more directed to the trustee in the room. And that would be, should we consider any more options? I mean, these are already a lot of benefit options, but would we want the self-funded COLA option to give more flexibility, or to have COLA options that are, and I think we talked about this, but if I went to say 3%, I'd probably really decimate the first year's payment. But I don't know if that was ever a discussion that we looked at. And the other thing that we talked about, and none of us have the answer to this one, but the possibility related to the COLA of if there would be a variable settlement option that anyone would be interested in. And I may be the only person ever to be interested in that, somewhat true in industry also. But the potential way a variable settlement would work is rather than saying, I'll use a bad example where I should say sub-account rather than mutual fund, but to be clear, if I take a settlement that's $1,000 a month, that's one way to take a settlement. Another way I could take it in a variable settlement is to say I will take a settlement that is 100 shares of a mutual fund a month. And if the mutual fund is $10 at 100, that would just be 1,000 at that point. And if it goes down, my payout goes down. And if it goes up, the payout goes up. But it's a way to have, it would be the big roller coaster of the COLA formula to look at that type of a settlement. It was something that was done in the industry for a while, but not a lot of people took to it because typically those with annuities were more interested in a fixed settlement than a variable. I know it was one thing we mentioned to the actuary, and at the time that we had come up with the variable component to crediting, I'd just be curious to keep that on the conversation level to see if any states ever develop something along that line or the actuary has ever engaged to develop it. So thanks for listening to me on that. But if there's an interest in different COLA options and if we would hear that from employees, that might be of value. So thanks for listening.
So I would say, Mr. Chair, that the options that are there now are the options that are available to Capers 1 and Capers 2. They're consistent across all three groups. The difference being the COLA, that's unique to the Capers 3 group.
Thank you. Representative Miller.
Just a comment, I love it when you start showing off.
I'm not sure how to respond to either of the two pieces of the comment. Representative Riley.
I just wanted to add to your, I think it was page 8 when you were talking about that of, so if a employee leaves early, was that page 8? You had that discussion? 9? So when somebody leaves early, before the 5 years of vesting, they take their money, they take the 4%, but the other piece of that you kind of implied, but that employer's money stays in the fund, they don't get that back, so that adds to the value of that fund that was no longer has liability against that piece, right?
That's right.
Not sure how stimulating this is, but I have a one account that is set up similar to this. In other words, there's my contribution, there's an employer contribution, and each earns interest. There's a slightly different tax treatment when you take it out. Is that true for this, or is it all treated the same?
This would be treated the same as all other Capers benefits. So at the state level, there would be no tax, no income tax on the Capers benefit. On the federal level, the contributions are made pre-tax, so they are taxed on the payment of benefits, not on the contribution. So they're reduced from taxable income during the working career and then paid as income tax on the federal level as benefits.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you for the overview. I greatly appreciate your work on that and everything else related to Capers. And committee, that completes our work at the moment. If you have questions on any of the other bills and their progress, feel free to catch me. On the mandate bills, we have submitted a letter on the PANS and PANDAS and the tobacco cessation. We're working on it on the mental health so that we can approach the first speed bump, if you will, on those topics as we get to time down the road. But That's the only other thing aside from those bills that we had passed out that we moved ahead on. Research folks let me know that we could send a letter to the state plan to approach the data for the cost benefit and the social impact statement so that we could better assess those. So that's the only other thing that has happened. Any questions from the committee? Comments for the good?
Do we have a meeting tomorrow?
We do not. So this would be our last meeting unless something falls apart and we've got to meet quickly to put something back together. So anyway, Beyond? Good on that. Have I missed anything? But we're good on minutes, right? So with that, committee, thanks for your patience, and
Mr.
we're
Chairman.
adjourned. Oh, wait, what do we have?
Hey, I just wanted to thank you for your leadership during my first session as a legislator, and I appreciate all the time you've taken to kind of welcome me to the committee and the process, and just being a resource of information. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. You bet. Yes, thank you. Thank you. We're adjourned. We'll see you.